right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jane Coffin. I'm the moderator for this fabulous panel of Broadband Strategies in the United States and Canada. Thank you to the organizers of the event for having us all here. Thank you to Jolly. We must acknowledge that because he's helping us live stream. Thank you, Jolly. Round of applause. I'm going to do 2-second intros because we have the bios of these wonderful panelists on the website. Grace Abuhamad is the Chief of Staff at NTIA. She has a long career at both NTIA and ICANN. Marita Moll is President of Telecommunities Canada. She's a member of the North American Regional At-Large Organization, otherwise known as NARALO. And if you're going to ICANN next week, you're going to find out more about the RALOs. Ron De Silva. Ron is an executive leader, international board member, advisor, and internet technology expert, 30 plus years of proven business, and also someone that's well known at the ICANN space. I'm not well known at the ICANN space, but I have been in the internet space for over 25-something years, was at the Internet Society for 10 years, and work for a startup right now. So I'm going to try and speak slower for those of us who've come in from other places and points beyond. Here's how the panel's going to run. We have up until about 4:45, and we recognize there's a panel directly after this one. So we're going to give a little grace to the other panel, give ourselves probably around till 4:40. Marita is going to speak first. She has some slides. Grace is second. Grace has handed out a doc to you, and it's going to be useful to her presentation. And Ron will speak after Marita. So Marita has some slides, and I trust that the slide master will help us get the slides up. Is that Eduardo?
Are you doing the slides?
And
The slide coordinator is gone.
Okay.
Taking pictures.
All right, while we wait for the slide coordinator. Hi, everybody. It's getting towards the end of the day.
Maybe turn that mic
Yeah.
toward you, yeah.
Okay, let's move it up. This one here. I'll just do this. Getting towards the end of the day, and everybody is probably suffering from a bit of information overload. I usually am by the time I've seen a few panels all day long. So I hope that you can stick with us. This is a panel about Canadian broadband and American and U.S. broadband strategy, but I'm very conscious of the fact that this is not going to relate that well to many of you who are here. You have your own broadband issues at home and strategies that you're trying to build or have been built. So what I've tried to do in my presentation here is to put it in a much larger framework. I was involved back in the 90s in Canada when we were talking about broadband strategies and those things, and everybody was really excited. We had research groups running research, studies and workshops talking about. Sorry.
someone needs to share the screen to Zoom.
Share the screen to Zoom and then switch.
Okay, gracias.
Okay, we haven't started that yet anyways. So we were developing various ways of rolling out internet access at that time when government was just as confused and befuddled by what was going on as the rest of us. How were we going to deliver this stuff to people? So we were actually getting some airtime. People were listening to us at that time. Researchers and public policy advocates were really playing a role in how people thought about these things. Didn't actually work out that things were rolled out that way, but at that time it was pretty exciting. So what I want to do here is show you this particular slide.
You had it behind you. Right to the next one.
It's coming. It's coming. Anyway, this one is not indicative of the weather outside. No. Next slide. Yeah, it's a rainbow. Well, it's sunny. It is that sunny. It hasn't been raining. We developed this in some of us in the research space to describe what needs to happen if you're going to have an internet access strategy in a country. And we put it together as 7 different layers of things that need to be developed, and many of them at very much the same time, or all of them, or quickly after another. You'll see that the very first one is carriage facilities, and that's all about, getting the broadband to where you are. And that's a biggie. It's a huge one, and that's the one we're still mostly talking about 20 years later. But the second one then is, the fact that you actually have to have the devices. You have to have the laptop computers. You have to have the mobiles. You have to have all those things to use what you're going to get in the number one, carriage facilities. The software tools, the web, the browsers and all that didn't even exist when we started this. And you need to have that's the next layer that comes up on top of it. You need the ISPs, the people who are going to come to the market and make it possible for you to have these services. You need the content. Why would you have it? It's got to be some content. There's a bit of a chicken and egg thing here. What comes first, the access or the content? Everything pretty much comes at the same time. You've got something called literacy and social facilitation. People were talking about that in a previous panel and how important that was, that you couldn't just put it in there and walk away, that you had to have a strategy for really delivering this, and sustainable strategy, because these things change and people need to continue to learn their way through this kind of a change. And over the whole thing, you have the big one, the big red, ooh, all right, we lost our rainbow, but it's okay. It's the same thing. You have the big red governance. Do you want to go back one? Okay. We're just practicing here. Oh, that's okay.
Because I can take the slides here, but not in the internet.
Oh, okay. Anyways, over top of all those other 6 layers, you have the governance layer. You had to have the government role in helping to make sure that all of these things get delivered to the people who need them. And so that's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be done in order to get universal access to everybody. Here it is. Now, yeah. Where are we now? So the goal of all of this, anyways, is universal access. It's not just broadband strategy. And I think we've fallen into the loop of just talking about broadband strategy for a long time now and not talking about all of the other layers that need to come together, which means that often they're not totally funded or supported in ways that they need to be. It's not that people don't want to do it, but it falls off the radar. Obviously, the first band, those access facilities, it's got to happen. It's taking a long time to get up there for the people who are a little more remote, but we have to have the governance side of it and government up there making it an absolute priority. I love the public-private partnerships panel in that there were just so many really great examples of how some of this is being delivered right there on the ground. It never occurred to me that there were some countries where you were actually able to buy 1 minute access, like real pay-as-you-go, or a 5 minutes just to upload or download. There's all kinds of various models going on out there. Not that, we necessarily want that, but it gives some people access who really couldn't get it at all otherwise. So that was great. So there were lots of good models out there, but they all fit. All of this fits in somewhere in this access strategy, this 7-layer strategy of universal access. So when I go through these different things, what I thought was, I'm going to give you the Canadian examples, but I hope that you can look at wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, whatever context you're in. How does that look in your country, in your area? If it's the governance session, what kind of groups are out there, advocating for that in your country? I'll give you a list of ours, but You know, that was my intention here. So here, oops.
I think you have to carry on without the slides for a sec.
Sorry, I'm just going to keep on going here. The Canadian federal government broadband program, and whenever we get the slides up, you'll see each one of these. I've highlighted where on that 7-layer strategy this falls. The Canadian federal government program falls in the carriage facilities, the number one and shortest part of that rainbow. Yes, we have in Canada, we say we have 98% of Canadians connected to high-speed internet by 2026. We think we now have about 93 or 94%, and the plan is to have 100% connected by 2030. What does that mean, connected? It's not fiber optic connection, obviously, but it does have a definition, at least 50 megabits per second download and 100 upload. So 50-10. It's not fabulous, but if you're living way up in the woods in northern Ontario, you know, it's way better than what you've got. And the other part of it was to have access along major road corridors, so people would be able to communicate when they were traveling, which is a big deal for us, big country. Okay, we're still not there?
Sorry.
It's okay.
Trying to do the screen and the Zoom at the same time.
Oh, it's okay. I think everybody's following me. They don't need to see the pictures. There are some specific federal initiatives. One of them is a $585 million initiative to deal with the last mile for 975 rural communities, including indigenous communities. One thing I wanted to say here is that I was going to bring this in the public-private partnerships panel, but I decided to leave it for here. In Canada, anyways, some of the indigenous communities really took the ball at the very beginning and said, no, we're not going to do public-private partnerships. We want to own we want to own what goes on here. We're the ones who are going to run the project. We don't want the money to go out of our community. We want it to stay in. We will contract the telcos and do the other work that needs to be done. We're going to organize it and manage it and control it. And some of them have done a really, really good job of that through hundreds of kilometers of northern Ontario. You've got a major network called KNET that started way back in 1994. When they made that decision, they were going to own it. We've tried to do a lot in Canada, talk about community-owned networks, but, as was indicated in the panel before, it's a hard road. You have to have everybody motivated and on the same page. So a lot of these things are being done by public-private partnerships. And that's just the way either in many times it happens or it doesn't. There's a big universal broadband fund, $3.2 billion altogether for rural and underserved communities. And then there's a special fund for the First Nations, which I just described in our country anyways, is in many places operating quite differently. They're the ones who are owning their own infrastructure. There are also some other communities who do, but it's hard and they're much fewer. Broadband timelines, as I said, by 2030, the government is hoping to have 100% of Canadians up there access to what they call what they define as high-speed internet, and everyone hopes they'll get there. But it's these are aspirations. We've come a long way in the years in between the mid-90s and now. So we're almost there, but there's still quite a bit to be done. There are other little projects going on in Canada. On the federal government side, you've got a Canadian satellite company who's providing connectivity to the far north. You've got the Canadian government giving software tools to small businesses. to upgrade their digital technology. So that kind of falls into a different part of that 7-layer structure. If you're talking about software tools, that's like number 4 or something. It's not just the carriage line, which is mostly what we're talking about. And then there's also the issue that the federal government really does carry the big load of the ball when it comes to governance, obviously, and they are doing a lot of work around legislation, content, and affordability issues. Oh, look at that. That's the wrong one. But anyways, let's go with it. Just run. Run with it. Keep going. Let's go down to about, push it down. Push it down. It's the same slides. It doesn't matter if that one's crooked. Okay. So we have got now, yes, we talked about that. We also have in Canada a regulator, which is called the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. Certainly in the U.S. there's a heavy-duty regulator. In Europe they have them. Don't know if they happen in all the other countries that are represented here. The regulator is also heavily involved in that governance stream that overarches all the other parts of the universal access rainbow. In Canada, one little interesting quirk is that the regulator actually has a $750 million fund, which they're devoting to access carriage issues. But that money is actually coming from the telecommunications companies, and it's part of their public interest commitment to providing access. It's not as much as that federal government is providing in their plan, but it's kind of an interesting little tweak that the regulator is doing this. Speaks to what we used to do in Canada many years ago around the telephone, in that we subsidized access in rural areas with some of the the funds that were coming into the telephone companies from the urban areas, and this is sort of a vestige from that. And people were talking about that at the time in the 90s. Why are we not subsidizing with the government, through the government, some of the rural and remote access issues? We're finally doing it, but it's taken a long time. No, we're still not there.
We have about a minute left.
Sorry? Just a minute. Okay, yeah, I'm almost there. So we had an Auditor General's report recently in March, which told the federal government that really they had to hurry up and do this, that the numbers weren't as high as they said they were. But the other thing that was really interesting about it was at the level of families, the Auditor General in Canada said the government needs to assess affordability in the context of household incomes when rolling out the access programs. So it doesn't matter if they all have this when they can't afford to do it, when they can't afford to buy it, they can't pay for it. That was an important addition to the program that we got from that report. The next layer, digital literacy accessibility. We have a number of organizations in Canada that do digital literacy work, but as we heard in the privacy, the public partnerships group, much more work like that has to be done all over the place, and it needs to be sustainable. It can't be one-shot deals and then people don't have anywhere to turn when they actually have a problem. No, not there and there. We have a lot of provincial programs. Provincial government also gets involved. And I'm almost at the end. I'm at other sources of funding. So other sources of funding come from the community, from the actual provinces who put money in, and then they share some of the load. The municipal, local, and community initiatives are also important. We're going to be having a panel at ICANN, which is going to include some community members to talk about what they're going to be doing. But we heard some really great stuff at the public-private partnerships one. People are doing work at the community level, which is things that are really touching people on the ground. Oh, yes, there, that one. We've already been there. And then the one thing I wanted to say is that at that time, we had a lot of advocacy networks and research networks who were looking into this and speaking to policymakers about what needs to be done. We have another list here on the slides that I did. It's a shorter list. These people are still working. Maybe in your countries, think about it. How many people are out there holding the government to account for what's actually happening? Because that's what needs to happen. People need to get out there and make sure their voices are heard. The telcos are out there with their big lobbyists, and their voices are heard. So if there's nothing coming from the general public and the research network showing how and why this stuff needs to happen and get to the people on the ground and be sustainable and accessible, then we haven't got a national access strategy. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was 15 minutes. Excellent. Grace, you're up. 10 to 15, you pick.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Abuhamad. I'm at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is the big federal entity in the United States that is administering the broadband, the internet access work in this administration. I don't have any slides for you, but I did pass around, or with the help of Jonathan, passed around a set of one-pagers. I won't be going through all of them in detail, but I thought they would be helpful for you because there are a lot of different programs that we're administering. They have different purposes, different amounts of money associated to them, et cetera. So sometimes having a leave behind, it's also online on the resources page, but it just helps. It helps me on a daily basis keep track of all the programs. Most of you know, we've been talking about the digital divide for over 20 years now. And in fact, the term itself was coined by a former administrator of the agency that I work for. This is a historic moment for the US government. We have been given this ambitious, simple but ambitious mission, which is to connect everyone in the United States. And that is a huge project because it has been attempted a few times before, but this time the difference is there is a very, very big, very, very big investment being associated to it. So I'll walk through this for you, but this administration and Congress passed what we call the bipartisan infrastructure law in November of 2021. And that included roughly $65 billion for infrastructure investment in different connectivity funds in the United States. And that includes the 50 states and territories of the United States. So it is a big program when you think of where Guam is located and other territories of the United States, right? There are some key pieces of this. I'll walk you through each one of the programs, but the simple mission here is also so connect everyone in the United States and connect them with reliable and affordable internet service. So there's no point, I think Marita said this earlier, there's no point really in connecting people if they can't use the service, if they can't afford the service, and if the service in some way is unreliable, then they're not really using the service, right? So we've defined, I challenge you a little bit, as part of preparing for this panel, I did a lot of comparing of Canada and the US. I challenge you a little bit to think about that and your respective countries as we're discussing the topic. We define what reliable service is differently than the way Canada's defined it. We've put a different set of restrictions or even not restrictions, but sort of requirements on the program, and different than what Canada has provided. We have different sources of funding, different programs. So we can compare and contrast all of those shortly in the discussion, but as we're going through the presentations, I challenge you to think about that a little bit. The theme for this school, the Internet Governance School, is access and inclusion, right? And if you think about the internet today, it's not, you understand why this mission was key for this administration. The internet is an essential tool now. It's not a luxury. It's not something that's fun, a hobby for people. It might have started off that way for some, but today it's an essential tool to provide access to work, healthcare, justice. We've talked a little bit about different examples of that throughout the day, but this is a very big initiative, and in part, in some ways, despite how difficult the COVID-19 pandemic was, I think it demonstrated to people the need for this essential service, an essential tool. So you can look at the handout I gave, but basically there are 5 key programs that we're administering. Not all of them were funded purely out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Some of them had funding that existed before and were either re-upped or, sort of re-upped or coordinated by my agency as part of this effort. So we call this, as the shorthand, we call it the Internet for All program, and there are 5 different pieces of it. So the first one, and the largest one, is the Broadband Equity Access and Development Program. We call that the BEAD program. And that is a big state grant program. That, again, this is for a comparison point for you, Canada has a number of provinces, we have a number of states and territories. The way that the BEAD program is designed is that it is a roughly $42 billion program with money going directly to the states and to the territories. So we as the federal agencies, grant them the funds, and from there, they develop programs that are best suited to their specific state. You can imagine, just like in Canada and other parts of the world, each state has a different geography, a different local community, et cetera, and so we want to give the states some flexibility in how they design those programs. There are, however, requirements for how they design the programs, and that is part of the sort of the federal-state interaction. One of the key pieces in a lot of these programs, but especially in BEAD, is that they're required to do local coordination. So when we're talking about multi-stakeholder engagement and internet governance and sort of the work that we're doing here, it's an interesting piece that the states are doing the same, and they're required to do that and demonstrate that they've engaged with their communities as they're building out these programs. The second key program is the Digital Equity Act, the Digital Equity Program. So there's 2 pieces of them, but roughly there are $3 billion there for either state-level grants or sort of a competitive grant program. This is to provide, again, Marita talked about this, the devices, the skills, the training that for people, once they come online, or even for people who are already online but need additional skills, these are programs designed for that capacity building exercise. The third program is another roughly $3 billion program for tribal or indigenous community grants to households or local anchor institutions. So again, focusing there on a particular community. The indigenous communities are covered in the other 2 programs, but this was we're going to give a specific pot of money dedicated to indigenous connectivity in the United States. We say tribal, but indigenous, First Nation, essentially the same thing. The fourth program on your sheet is what we call the Middle Mile Grant Program. That's $1 billion dedicated to middle mile infrastructure. So maybe not as, maybe not as cool and engaging as some of the other programs because your end user is less engaged on a middle mile program, but very important in terms of keeping costs low. So when you think about, and maybe Ron will talk a little bit about this in his presentation, but sort of when you're developing infrastructure, you've got the big capacity that happens sort of at one level, then you've got your middle mile connection, and then you've got your last mile connection where you want to make sure that's where the users are paying for service, engaging, and you want to make sure there's enough competition across the board, but especially at the last mile level. So the middle mile piece, really the goal of that program is to reduce the cost of the last mile connections for users. And then the last program, which was not through the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we have sort of grouped it together in our work, is a pilot program called the Connecting Minority Communities program. And that is the smallest, $260 million for us to connect and do skill building with historically black communities and universities, minority serving institutions, some tribal institutions, and a variety of other sort of covered populations or minority populations in the United States that would benefit from sort of a concrete effort on skill building. So that That program is designed to go to institutions that would then initiate or manage programs for building skills across the United States. So we have those are the variety of programs. We can talk more about what each of them mean, how they're going, what we can learn from other countries as we develop them. I think Canada's program for 2030 is ambitious. Ours is ambitious as well. We look forward to sort of inspiring other countries to do the same or learning from their experiences. Hand it over to Ron.
Excellent. And we have Ron. And Ron, you have a couple slides, yes? So
We'll find out.
we'll find out. Why don't we just have you start, and you've got 10 to 15, and you're off and running.
Thank you. So I wanted to take the presentations you got from Marita and from Grace. We're talking about policies and funding, and really the government's taking an initiative to create incentives and really address accessibility issues in rural parts of North America. That's fundamentally what is motivating a lot of those programs. And I was going to take a different lens and look at it from a business and a technical perspective. How does that actually impact the marketplace, and what is going on throughout Canada and throughout the U.S. based on those funds that are being pushed through in these variety of programs? I think there's a big one, just to add, Grace, because I had a question on the material you presented around the Treasury Department. They have a separate component, which is another, what was that, $20 billion or something like that, right? What
That's
was that
right.
number?
I only presented on the programs that my agency runs, but there's a huge number of programs across the federal government, including the Treasury programs. I think 20 billion might be.
Yeah, so there's another very large component in the U.S. ecosystem that's impacting businesses and operators in their efforts to get the last mile completed in many rural and what I would call ultra rural parts of the country. And similarly, I think you're seeing that in Canada. So that said, I have 4 slides. And the first 2 are really going to talk about some of the technology, and then I want to talk about some use cases, some examples. So first slide might advance. As we wait for that to show up, it doesn't show there. It doesn't show here either. So I'm very high level. What are the technologies that broadband addresses? If you look back into the legacy of telecommunications, a lot of it was all twisted pair. Small little pieces of copper stranded along telephone lines all over the place to create telephone services. And those same copper wires were used in the 90s to develop DSL. And DSL was a great bridge technology, enabled telecom operators to leverage their installed infrastructure to provide more throughput than you could get with a dial-up service. That's really what DSL provided. Is that useful today? A lot of people would argue no. And a lot of these programs aren't really focused on helping create more DSL. It's sort of a long-term technology that's lingering, and a lot of communities are now frustrated trying to, I don't know, use Zoom to talk to their family members or to work from home, and that's not really a technology that's going to help. Another is mobile. Right? Mobile is really convenient in urban areas where there are plenty of people to justify building towers, and there are lots of towers then in place that provide a density and give you reasonable connectivity to make phone calls, maybe do Zoom while you're driving, be able to order Amazon while you're supposed to be sitting in a meeting, right? These are the things that maybe your mobile phone will provide you, but when you move into urban, rural areas or really ultra rural areas, the cell tower density is not there. The radio coverage doesn't exist. The throughput, which is required from the towers to get back to the rest of the world where maybe the data centers are located and where the content is that you're interested in, that doesn't exist either. So even if you might have a good, strong carrier, how many of you, looked at your phone and said, I've got 5 bars, why isn't my Zoom working? Well, you've got radio connectivity, but there's no backhaul. It doesn't go anywhere. So mobile is interesting, but is it broadband? Is it really impacting the rural markets? No, not really. And another here is DOCSIS. Cable companies have invested in years and cable TV infrastructure, all with coaxial cables, and a mix of that and fiber kind of extend their infrastructure out to the end users. But again, in most cases, that's in suburban and urban areas. It's not really that prevalent in rural markets, especially ultra-rural markets. So even though there are capabilities on with the DOCSIS specifications to push higher bit rates through on coaxial and fiber systems, it really is not that impactful for rural markets. So next slide. So those are things that aren't working. Some other things that are being attempted, wireless, and what I mean by wireless is licensed and unlicensed spectrum done in sort of a directional wireless transmission, and then when it's in a small cluster of homes, use unlicensed spectrum like you would a big Wi-Fi hotspot. Think of it that way. That provides some value, it provides some connectivity, but again, it's really hard to scale that when you have no density. If everybody lives miles and miles or kilometers and kilometers from each other, a simple radio to do, public Wi-Fi is not going to help anybody other than the one barn on somebody's farm, right? So interesting, has its place, not really addressing the rural market. And then LEO, right? There's all this cool stuff that you're probably hearing about, these new companies doing this low orbit satellite infrastructure. And yes, that might fill some of the gaps, not only in rural markets, but think of national parks, think of floating around in the middle of the ocean. I mean, large chunks of this planet are nowhere near anything of interest from an infrastructure standpoint. Maybe that's going to provide some coverage. Technologically, sure. Economically, there are a lot of questions about the cost to throw all those satellites in the sky, the cost to aggregate all that traffic and do something with it, and will the economics really make sense? I mean, you see that in the funding that's going to some of these startups around low orbit internet services. It's a question mark. I don't know the answer. Maybe it's going to be something useful, maybe not. And then lastly, fiber. Fiber, okay, I'll share my bias. Yes, I like fiber. It's a great technology. It's got a lot of transmission capability across it, but it's very expensive. We talked about economics of getting to these, long distance locations where fiber doesn't exist. So talking about that middle mile, it is not there, right? And if without a middle mile, you can't have a last mile. And that's one of the reasons why the NTIA is focused on that. A lot of the, I think some of the applicants for the funds in Canada are also including middle mile infrastructure to get out to rural parts of the countryside. Think of a small hamlet, 200, 300, 400 people that maybe live in a small area, and between them and the next hamlet, miles, kilometers. There's a lot of distance. If there's no extension cord, you're not putting anything there that's going to be useful. So that's really, from a tech standpoint, fiber would be great if it were cheap. Fiber would be great if you can just magically make it happen, but you can't. And that's really driving some of the incentives from the government to help coordinate with the states, coordinate with private money, coordinate with operators to find some way to really incentivize getting that last mile done for rural America, rural Canada, and the farthest, remotest parts of North America. Next slide. So that's the tech. I want to provide an example. So I live here. I'm in the DC suburbs. I live in Loudoun County. That's pictured in the map here. You can see DC is way over here where it says Washington, and this big funny looking shape that's got a red outline to the left. That's the county where I live. And if you are from out of town and you flew into the Dulles Airport, that's in like the sort of the right edge of that big red county outline. So you just landed in the edge of Loudoun County and then came into DC if you flew in to Dulles Airport. Well, I live right there. I'm on the Communications Commission for Loudoun County. I've gotten visibility in that capacity, not only what's happening with the broadband operators in the county, but also how are these programs we're talking about impacting rural communities? Why? Well, if you divide Loudoun County in half, you can see a highway right in the middle called the yellow line from Leesburg down, called Route 15. There are some 400,000+ people that live in the county. 80% of them live to the right of that yellow line. The other 20%, it's mostly a rural farm community. A lot of horse farms, a lot of cows, a lot of crops, and a lot of trees, a lot of great. I mean, you can see this bottom left picture. This is what you look when you look west in the western half of the county out towards the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is what you see. It's beautiful. What does that mean? Well, the people who live out there, they don't want some big ugly cell tower there. So there aren't any cell towers. Cell coverage is abysmal. There's, the density out there is very low. Like I said, 80% of the county lives east of the Route 15. 20% of the county is spread out all over the other half. And the economics just don't make sense on their own. If I'm a service provider and I'm looking at spending $20,000 to put a 100 meg bidirectional fiber connection to your farm, and I can charge you $100 a month. Somebody do the quick math. How long does it take for me to actually turn a profit? That's just the capital cost to build the thing, but I still have an operating cost annually to maintain and then to grow because capacity is going to continue to drive demand. So it's not just the cash up front. There's an ongoing cost. So the economics just don't make sense, right? So that's what we had in Western Loudoun. And through these programs, there were roughly 8,600 homes that we identified, 8,600 farms basically in the western part of the county that had zero internet access. Their mobile coverage was abysmal. There's no such thing as DSL. Some of them tried some of the line of sight radio infrastructure. It worked for maybe one or two of them, but think what happens when you have a bunch of hills. It's kind of hard to get a radio signal line of sight to somebody's house if there's a bunch of trees and a bunch of dirt and rock in your way. So not a really good option. 8,600 homes were identified, and we came together. So talking earlier about private public partnership arrangements and also about NTIA and Treasury funding options. Also, the state of Virginia has its own incentives to try to encourage to close that digital divide throughout the state. So these organizations came together. SEGRA, who was looking to initially negotiate just a basic fiber infrastructure sale to the county. The commission got involved, and we said, well, this is great. It's useful for the schools. It's useful for the public utilities and public infrastructure parts of the county that they're responsible for. But if we can leverage that as last mile, find a way to encourage the operator to put extra infrastructure in place beyond what they need just to meet the county's needs, then they could use that as a way to incentivize other broadband operators to jump into the western part of the county. And so we were successful at that, getting it added to the contract and having a way to ensure anybody can come and use that as a last mile, as a middle mile way to get out to the western part of the county. So that existed. And then All Points Broadband is an operator. I think they're middle of the state based, and they're hitting lots of markets in a rural way throughout Virginia and also North Carolina and some of the surrounding states. And so they came, along with many others, bid on an opportunity to get some county funding, some state funding, federal funding, and mix all that together and really address these 8,600 homes that are left. So from the Virginia fund, they were able to, so this is 60 million, think about it, 8,600 homes, $60 million to build it. Quick math, how much is that? $7,000, something like that, order of magnitude. So let's say they're not an ACP. And remember that term from earlier, affordable care program, a way to get internet access for $30 a month. Let's pretend like you're not one of those. And you're maybe $100 a month, 100 meg service or 1 gig service or whatever, right? How many months does it take to get your capital back if you spend $7,000 to build out to one of these things? That's like 5+ years, right? That's not a good business plan. That doesn't make sense. So, but if you take some of that cost off the table through the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, that's the VADI, they were awarded $18 million. Oh, by the way, I'm sharing all this because by sitting on the commission, this is all public information, so I was able to just kind of use this as a great example without having to go through NDA issues I've got from other programs, but I do from my consulting practice. So that's where this is coming from. So they got just under $18 million, and then through the ARPA plan that's administered through the Treasury Department, they got another $12 million. And then the company itself went to private equity, mentioned them down here, Searchlight, kind of backed them and gave them some cash from a private equity standpoint. And then they did some partnerships with some of the utilities in the area. Dominion Energy is the primary electrical supply utility for the state of Virginia. And they have right-of-ways that go through a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of the countryside, where they have their, high power delivery infrastructure, and that gives them a easy way to put, new lines down and reach throughout the county. Same with Novak. Novak is a utility co-op in part of the Northern Virginia area. So by leveraging partnerships with both of them, as well as having access to SEGRA for some of the middle mile, and then the federal funds, and put it all together, now it works. The numbers work, the build works. They're a couple years out from having service delivered to these 8,600 homes. So great example applied there. Jane? We're at time. Well, one last slide. So that's Loudon. Let me talk about a couple of different issues when you go rural and you go north. Like in Canada, so same kind of stuff applies that I just talked about in rural parts. But big chunks of Canada are frozen for a big chunk of the year. You can't do construction. You can't build. Even if you have the money, you cannot go out and do the work. So they got to wait until it thaws and it's soft enough that you can go dig in the ground and put infrastructure in. It's a little different. Distances are considerably longer. So you have to leverage other technologies as a way to try to make that work and still not break the economics, right? If I'm talking about 8,600 homes packed into, half of the county, and you put, I don't know, Marita, 800 homes packed into Northern Ontario, like the economics are very, very different. They hit them than it is the 8,600 in Western Loudon. So other limitations there, and I question the whole everybody's going to get it if you're counting mobile, because my generality of like what mobile is like in rural parts of Canada is it sucks.
I don't think they're counting mobile when they're doing the charts.
Yeah, so they're not counting mobile when they're doing the charts. That's what Marita said. But I want to make sure if somebody's out in rural parts of Manitoba or whatever, and they have mobile, they're probably not happy, and they're used to not having internet. So there's that whole education thing we talked about earlier. Until they know what they're missing and how this might enhance and make their lives better, they may not be complaining, right? The mobile's not good. They don't know why they need internet. So there's an education component to it. So that is a couple of ways that these programs are impacting North America, and how I think collectively that's helping address some of the digital divide and get some inclusivity in place. Jane.
Excellent. So for some of our guests here in the room from other countries, basically Canada and the United States are getting subsidies from their governments, for the infrastructure, and because it's so expensive to build out. So it's more of a Kickstarter, isn't it, in some ways, because the estimates are upwards of $100 billion, I think, for the United States if you're going to try and cover a lot of the U.S. Question for you on digital equity and inclusion, because this is a big buzzword in the United States right now, and every person that's working with funding programs is talking about digital equity and inclusion. Do you train people first and then give them broadband, or do you give them broadband and train them after? What do you think? So 1-minute answers if we can, so that we can do some speed rounds here. Marita, you're up.
You can't train people if you don't have any internet there to train them on. So you have to do many of these things at the same time.
There's some offline broadband tools that people are using in developing countries. I've spent 25 years working around the planet, so you can use a MacBook with, or a different device with different information on it to do some offline training. But that's a really great point. So Grace, what do you think?
We're doing both, and we're working with communities to get them excited about what the possibilities are. And when you kind of start imagining the possibilities, then it sort of takes you in different directions.
Yeah, obviously I'd say both too, but I'm going to point back to, Grace, something you said earlier, which is, hey, COVID helped. That was like a big education for a lot of people. Just living in Loudoun County and hearing the challenges of the western part of the county of kids are now supposed to do school, but what is Zoom? How does that work? They don't have internet. So they're like literally sitting in the parking lot of McDonald's or the library, because the libraries are closed, by the way, so you can't go in the library, but maybe you can sit in the parking lot and hope to get a spot of Wi-Fi. So that education part of why you might need it, I think, was accelerated by COVID.
So digital marginalization, or the digital divide, as Grace had said, Larry Irving, who's a former administrator at the NTIA, who was my boss when I worked there, helped coin the term in the United States. For those of you that might know what the International Telecommunication Union is, the ITU, if you look back 50 years, almost 40, there's something called the Maitland Commission Report. It's called the Missing Link Report. That report was about the telco fact, the fact that there wasn't telecom lines, some of the copper, deployed throughout the world. So now we have these gaps that are out there. There's been marginalization. Is this what the U.S. program is going to try and help solve right now, is that marginalization? Because some of these communities are a little cranky, particularly in the southeast part of the United States. I work with some folks in what are called the Black, Indigenous, people of color, the BIPOC communities. So if they don't have internet and they've got some really bad copper, and the COVID did say, gosh, this is the best advertising for building networks ever. It was for me and the communities I was working with. How do you work with other government agencies, Grace? Because this is one of the big deals. Government agencies weren't talking to each other before the pandemic. Some were, they were trying, right? So now what other agencies are you working with across the US government? And I'm gonna go to Marita after that, and then Ron, explanation about a little bit of what you're doing at the local level to get up to the state level. So Grace, who else does NTIA coordinate with?
That's good. So you heard when Ron was presenting, he asked about the Treasury program, and I gave the wrong number. It's actually 10 billion for Treasury, not 20. Big difference. So to Jane's point, when we mean connect everyone, we really mean connect everyone. We take that very seriously. Congress takes that very seriously, and they designed the programs in a way that there's sort of it's an all of the above approach, right? So there are grants that are administered by the federal government. There are grants that are administered by states with some oversight. There are grants that are directed at rural communities. There are grants that are directed at BIPOC communities, minorities, indigenous communities, et cetera. So there's all kinds of approaches here, and that's why I tried to outline some of them for you, because they all have a different flavor and a different mission and set of requirements associated to them. In terms of coordinating, so, that was the sort of instruction from Congress. In terms of coordinating in the government, I talked a lot about the Department of Commerce programs, the NTIA programs. Those are the ones where there's the majority of this broadband infrastructure funding. But like in Canada, we have an independent regulator, the Federal Communications Commission. They have had funds that they've administered historically, some of them like the ones that Marita mentioned that are funded with a sort of a public service commitment or sort of a tax on private companies, and others that were granted during this investment. So we work with the Federal Communications Commission. We work with the Department of Treasury. So they have the Capital Projects Fund, this $10 billion fund. That was designed primarily as in the context of the COVID pandemic, trying to create investments in all kinds of different pieces, economic recovery, right? So broadband is a piece of that, but it's not the only piece of that program. We work with the Department of Agriculture. They have a $1 billion program that is specific to expanding access in rural communities, because the main community of the Department of Agriculture is the farming community, and they are primarily based in rural areas. So giving them access has a sort of a specific mission and connotation there. So those are the overview programs, but I can tell you from the inside, there are lots of coordination meetings in the federal government with lots of different agencies, because even though those are the agencies, the ones that I just named are the ones that are the primary agencies administering these programs, we work with all of them because, there's an education component, there's a healthcare component, there's an energy and utility component to this. So there's a lot of coordination. The Department of Transportation is doing a lot of investment in infrastructure. Can we work with them so that we don't, when we're building and doing all these big projects, that they can be sort of coordinated? You're digging once, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of work across the government, a lot of coordination, and a lot of engagement at the state level too. I mentioned this to some of you earlier, but at NTIA, this is the first time we've had, since the bipartisan infrastructure laws passed, it's really the first time we've had a remote workforce. We talked a little bit about working remote earlier today. And some folks talked about how the government is increasing that access. We are kind of doing it by, just because we have to, by necessity, because we wanted to make sure that we had one NTIA employee in every state and territory across the United States, because we wanted to make sure that their job was to coordinate, ensure local coordination, work with state broadband offices. In order for that engagement to happen, we had to put people there, and we had to make them remote. Up until then, we had a staff that was primarily based in Washington, D.C., and some based in our research lab in Boulder, Colorado, but we didn't have a staff that was based across the United States. As the operations person for the agency, that changes the dynamic a lot. Every time there's a hurricane or emergency, I've got to find where people are, and it's I can't just focus on 2 locations. I'm focusing on 56. So there's a lot of coordination in the government, within the agency, across the government, federal, state, et cetera. And internationally, we work a lot with the ITU. We work with other governments. So it's a lot of work.
Excellent. Marita, you had mentioned Indigenous communities or the First Nations in Canada. How is the Canadian government coordinating with the First Nations communities?
Well, is that on? Yes, there is a particular fund focused particularly on the First Nations communities, and the government has been very active in trying to connect them. As I mentioned, they have been pretty proactive in telling the government exactly what it is that they required and how they wanted to see it rolled out. Quite a number of communities have got their own broadband networks. British Columbia has particularly been good at this in that they've had a First Nations Technology Council since I can remember in the mid-90s, and it has always been active. And BC has been busy, but they're still not finished. None of this stuff is finished. They're so remote, some of these places, it's hard to get to them. And as we're saying, coordination of all this stuff is really difficult. Some of this stuff has been going on for so many years, and it's still not done. And the money doesn't always get spent as the way it's supposed to get spent. We have this $4 billion program about small business adoption program. 3% of its budget was spent in the first year. So they're just not being able to roll it out. The business says, oh, but it's too complicated and there's too much red tape. You have to fix it before we can really use it. So there's still a lot of grit in the system. I don't know whether we're really going to get to 100% by that time, but I'm glad to see that people are actually talking about it, working on it, and I think it's the pandemic that did it. Everybody woke up and said, hey, we got to do this.
I'm going to come back to the point you just made about accountability in a sec, but Ron, you have a unique perspective because you're on a commission. Could you explain for some of our colleagues from other countries what that means and how you coordinate at the commission level in your city up to the state?
Yeah, and then I would love to make a comment about the Indigenous Canadian market challenges. The County of Loudoun has, from a government standpoint, there are 8 elected representatives. The county is kind of broken up into, remember I said there were 400,000 plus people there, so they're broken up into 8 times 40 to 50,000 people per, right? So it's divided by population. And like I said, like only 2 of them are in the western half, the other only. And then there's an at-large supervisor that's elected. So each district represents elects their representative. So those are the 9 representatives in the commission is really there to serve the supervisors, the elected officials, and advise them on primarily it generated from cable TV days on franchise agreements for cable TV distribution throughout the county, but it's evolved to be not just video distribution, but also broadband related activity. So that's really the role. And so our interactions as a commission with our supervisors as well as with county staff on activities that are going on from a legislative standpoint in the state of Virginia or legislative things that are coming out of the federal government, we interact with the legislative liaison and advise them and give them direction. We work with the grants and the IT program facilitators in the county who are the primary ones that are working with the state, and then through the state's help or directly with the federal programs. So we kind of work through that system. That's kind of a local view up into how that comes from a public version. But back to the Indigenous Canadian comment just for a minute. I think one thing that I've seen in Canada that's been exciting is in some of the Indigenous communities, you have a tribal council that can make a decision for the entire community to say, yep, we're putting broadband everywhere. And just wholesale, like, we're going to build the whole community and be done with it. And, you still have to connect it. You have to backhaul it to somewhere. But it makes the construction so much easier than, primarily a consumer environment where you need permission to go onto their property and dig it up and put a hole in their wall and stuff like that. Without permission, you're kind of limited what you can do. But if the tribal council says, yeah, we're doing everybody, you can just go and do it all. So that's kind of an interesting perspective on what's going on in Canada.
Yeah, and if there's more data on the Indigenous Connectivity Summit website, if any of you are interested, both at the Internet Society and Connect Humanity. The Indigenous Connectivity Summit, it was the 7th one, was just held in Alaska. I was part of the creation of that with Mark Buell, who many of you know, who's from Canada and worked for the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, CIRA, years ago, and he's also at Connect Humanity. But that ICS is a way, as Ron is saying, where a lot of the tribes do come together in the First Nations. Some sacred land you can't build on. You've got to figure out how to deal with that at the tribal level. So there's lots of different governance issues there. We're at about a speed round of a minute left for each of you because I want to make sure we get the other panel up here for their start. But accountability is something that's really important. And Marita, you had talked about the fact that maybe some of the money hadn't been spent in Canada. And Grace, you're up to around $60 billion that needs to be accounted for. This is a huge issue. And many of the communities at the local level are going to hold people accountable for A, either getting connectivity or not, B, where that money goes, and how are we keeping track of it? This is a massive issue. And some people I know are actually putting local covenants together at the local level to hold network providers responsible for connecting the and underserved first. So that's something that is a tactic that people are using at the local level, at the local last mile level, where if there's a build out, you've got to get to those folks that are unconnected first or underserved. So Ron, what would you say about accountability? Minute and a half.
Yeah, I've seen it's being implemented differently in each state. And it's really, I think, more of a state level that's then partnering with the locality. And I'm encouraged to hear NTIA is really ramping up their focus to help with that process, because I think that's overall gonna address the accountability component. I know here in Virginia, the Department of Housing and I forget the rest of the acronym stands for. They're leading that for the state, and they're putting a dashboard together and they're presenting to the citizens of Virginia. Here's where that money is going. Here's the accountability pieces, which who got awarded what money to where and how far are they along with their process and stuff. So it's there, but that is very different in other states. So I think that's a challenge, and I'm glad to hear NTI is that's on their radar.
And you have open meetings, yes, at your
Yes.
County level, right?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to say that. So for those of you that may work with regulators or policymakers or civil society and want to get in and talk to your governments, there are ways to obviously force that. And Marita, I turn to you at the end here after Grace to help us with civil society and working with government and accountability. So Grace, you're in an agency and you have a lot of funding that's going out the door. How are you holding the people that you're giving that money to accountable?
So there's two pieces to this. There's engagement and there's some technology. I'll start but I've already talked about how the programs were designed by Congress. They have a lot of requirements in them. If you pull the statute and then the notice of funding opportunities that we sent out, they're pretty involved. So there's a lot that we're sort of pre-setting here and requiring at the outset when states submit their plans. So that's one piece to sort of set the expectations. But the two pieces that I want to get to in the 1 minute here is engagement and technology, right? So in this case, again, unprecedented for NTIA level of engagement. We're out in every state, we're working with them, we're explaining the requirements, we're providing assistance where some of those requirements may be difficult for folks on workforce, on how they're going to serve, build out estimates, et cetera. So we're engaged deeply with communities, and I think they hold themselves more accountable when they know that they're engaged and that their local communities are engaged and watching too, right? So there's a lot of coordination both from the federal side and local communities on that piece. And then the technology piece, really interesting. Again, I come from at this from mostly the operational side of NTIA, but we have technology now and software that allows us to really track status of funds in a daily, minute by minute. We're really keeping up to speed. So we're building a lot of that capacity at NTIA right now, and it's new. This is government technology procurement. I will spare you the details, but it's a process. So we're doing that. We're building out some pretty state-of-the-art, or for government, state-of-the-art tech, and it's going to help us also track and monitor the funds that are administered at the state level.
Excellent. Marita, in a minute and a half, accountability, Canada, citizen level, interface with government. Pick one of those.
Yeah, I think everybody's going to anticipate my answer. The resources for that kind of thing are really, really slim. They used to be better. As I said, government was actually looking to civil society for some answers and some guidance. That is no longer really the case. It's always the opposition. And the voice it's very hard to get the voice in because obviously the lobbying that goes on in the background with the big telcos, that's where the government ears really are. We do what we can. We don't have access to the kind of trust funds that you have in the States. So, that's just not, and public advocacy groups don't really like to go to, vested interests for a lot of money because it doesn't look very good if you're being sponsored by Google or Facebook. So you can't go there either. So it's a very hard thing. I have to say, I was so grateful when Zoom came around and was everybody could access it, and there was a free part of it. We could actually meet as a group on Zoom. We hadn't been able to do that for years.
Wonderful. Give this panel a round of applause. Thank you very much. And we thank you all for listening. And we're going to turn it over to the next panel. But thank you for the great perspectives.